he would talk about his experience of California spirituality and about how problematic California spirituality was. So he styled himself a medieval Christian. But he would talk occasionally about people he thought that were just hopelessly reprobate. And he said the only saving grace for them is sudden death in a state of grace. They're temporarily and momentarily in a state of grace that God takes them before anything bad happens. I think that actually the role of general confession in the service of in our worship is more positively. It is both to remind us as well as actively provide a path into that experience of receiving the body and blood of Christ. In other words, to whatever degree we may not be prepared for it, it's meant to focus our preparation. And it's also meant to make that preparation possible because God does it. God forgives us. We don't have to kind of get ourselves into a mindset where, we get our thinking and our attention just right so that somehow we're worthy. Our worthiness to receive Eucharist, to receive the body and blood of Christ, is predicated on this sacrifice of Christ on the cross and the forgiveness of God in Christ. And so it's a straight path into the Eucharist. And the reason the peace follows the general absolution is because, as Natalie said, it's not about saying, hey, it's great to see you, how was your vacation, that kind of thing. What we're doing is we are exchanging the peace with one another, and we are enabled to exchange the peace of Christ, the wholeness of Christ, wish one another the wholeness of God's work in our lives, okay, which is what shalom or peace is all about. And the sacrament and the general confession gets us ready to do that. It's sort of to say we're able to share the peace of Christ, the wholeness, the healing of Christ with one another because we have been healed. Yeah. What's that, Dave?
Your description minimizes the power of the service. I don't agree with that.
Okay.
What description of what?
Dave says
Say
the
more.
description minimizes the power of the service.
It only lasts so temporary. It just gets you from the pew to the rail. I think that's crap. Sorry.
Okay, so without committing a sin. Okay, which is okay.
It takes away from the service. It takes away from the
well, and I don't. I understand how you would think that it takes away from the service and from the value of the Eucharist. Okay, what I was trying to explain to you was why that was originally put into the liturgy, and for late medieval, early modern Christians, I think they were much more worried about their sinfulness than we are. I think as 21st century Americans, we tend to not pay much attention to our sinfulness, and so we it seems to us like there's not much we need to be forgiven for, and I think that was the emphasis when the liturgy was put together the way it is, that there is in fact stuff that we need to be forgiven for. And in fact, the liturgy itself for the Holy Communion is about us being forgiven. I would never want to take away from the importance of receiving the body and blood of Jesus. I think that's incredibly important for us because it's transformative. But it doesn't, as you probably know from your own life, it doesn't necessarily last forever every week. Sometimes we get to Monday and we've, so and so the issue then is, how do we keep asking for forgiveness? How do we keep acknowledging our need for that forgiveness? And I think perhaps the confession in the service is a really good place to remember that. I had a friend one time who said, "I really wish we wouldn't do that. It always makes me feel bad." And she said, "And I don't do any of those things." Well, what things are you talking about? Because it says things done and left undone. Which things done and left undone haven't you done? So I don't mean to diminish it, Dave. It's just I do think that we worry sometimes less about where we are with Christ and with other people. We used to have this bidding that started, "Ye that do earnestly and heartily repent of your sins and are in love and charity with your neighbor." Okay, and it's the love and charity with our neighbor part that particularly concerned the English reformers. Are you holding a grudge with your brother? Do you not speak to your brother? Are you holding a grudge with your parents? Are you holding a grudge with your neighbor down the road who did something to your cow? It's whatever, but it's that love and charity with neighbor that it's designed to get to. So I don't know. So sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the important word there is spiritual practice. I don't know whether I'd use the word laissez-faire. I might say a regular way, an open-ended way. Oh, from the pew to, yeah, 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 yeah. Well, and I was sitting here thinking that Cranmer, knowing what he knew about English history, maybe thought that getting someone from the pew to the rail was about all you could do with the likes of Henry VIII. It's kind of like, let's see if we can get him to communion without him doing anything that disqualifies him from taking it. But I think it is really something that culturally we are in a very different place. I mean, I remember when I was going to seminary in the 70s, one of the new books on the market was a book by a Christian psychologist called Carl Menninger. And the title of the book was, now it's gone straight on my head, Whatever Happened to Sin? And what he talked about was the fact that language about sin had completely dropped out of Christian vocabulary by and large. And what I think is interesting about it is that Meninger's book is still in print. And I think his criticism is still appropriate. In fact, if anything, I think it may now be worse than it was when Menninger first wrote the book. Because I got to the point teaching seminarians for years that I occasionally told them, when we got into talking about sin and spiritual direction, I said, I fully realize that this may be the first time you've ever heard this word discussed in seminary. Uh, but if you think about it, if sin is about our becoming our own gods and about our having uh, no regard for the will of God, well, that's the that's the whole subtext of the gospel story of why we need Christ. I mean, one of the really strange things about that vocabulary sort of falling out of the way we talk about things is it may make us all a little bit more comfortable talking about it with one another because we don't put ourselves on the spot and we don't put anyone else on the spot and all the rest of it. But the odd thing is it then leaves you with the question, okay, well then what is it we are being saved from then? And what did Jesus die over? You know, whatever it was, it wasn't the fact that we haven't yet found the best therapist we could possibly identify, or that we are basically good people. That's not the presupposition of the gospel at all, and we're not meant to dwell there. It's not that I want to go back to fire and brimstone and sort of dangling people over hell, threatening them and coercing them to respond to what is God's great desire for healing. But until we recognize the fact that there are things that keep us from embracing that healing, we're always going to be in this kind of peculiar envelope of things where we go on worshiping and we go on confessing these things, but we've kind of lost the thread as to why it might be at all important to us, to our lives. Yeah.
Only a priest is
Robin?
the right of reconciliation.
Yes, and a bishop. There are a handful of things that priests and bishops can do, and the right of reconciliation is one of those that's restricted to priests and bishops. Well, it's not actually. I mean, in the Catholic Church, it's the same thing, and it again is something that you can only do with a bishop or with a priest.
Yeah, bishops sometimes forget, but they are still priests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Familiar to me, really.
Yeah.
No, it's
Yeah.
and it's here's the in the Middle Ages, even before that, the practice of confession started in the church because people were committing sins after their baptism. Okay. And if they committed a sin after their baptism, how were they to be certain of God's forgiveness? Okay. And so the whole practice of because very early on, if you were someone who had committed sins that the community knew about, and people, there was very little privacy in the ancient world, so people knew, when you were cheating your customers at the market, or you were not faithful to your wife, or whatever it was, they knew what you were doing, and so those people were set aside. They were forbidden to receive Holy Communion until they had gone through a confession. And it used to be done publicly in front of the congregation. But they discovered that more people were willing to do that if it was done privately in the company of the priest. And so they knew even at the time that especially if you had something troubling your conscience, the very best way to deal with it would be to name it. Okay? To say for the things done and left undone, it doesn't actually get at what we might be.
It works for a
done.
communal
Yeah, it works
setting.
for a communal
Works
setting,
communally.
but it doesn't actually get to what it is that troubles your conscience. So when you've named it, it's much easier to let go of it. Okay, that goes all the way back to Genesis. There's a power in naming something that it gives you power over it that you may not
Or
have
breaks
before,
its power over
or
you.
breaks its power over you.
Yeah.
And so I had a directee for one time, for example, who was addicted to pornography. Until he made his confession, it was very hard to let go of the addiction because he never would give it words. He would never talk about what it was. And so once we did that, the assurance of someone with skin on that God has forgiven you matters actually quite a lot to people. This is a principle that's the beginning of therapy. Until you name the reason why you're in therapy and you give it a specific quality and name, you can't say, well, I'm just a little depressed. Until you've named why you're depressed, therapy doesn't work. And then the therapist's job in part is to begin to help you let go of whatever that is. But we've known this for thousands of years. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Well, and no, it's the same, and that's a legitimate question. But yeah, it's the very same as it is in the Anglican tradition. It's just that as an ecclesial culture, I guess you could say, it's a bit more regular. Now, I don't know how frequent it is. In the Catholic Church, probably the frequency is ensured to some degree because when you are confirmed, you're required to go see your priest for confession.
well, you're required for First Communion.
For First Communion, and it was so funny. I heard one prominent entertainer say that he couldn't remember what he told the priest at his first communion, at age 12 or 11 or 12 or what it is. He said the thing he could remember was that when he walked out, there were a whole group of boys who were sitting in pews waiting to go in to say their confession, and they were all giggling. And he said, "What's so funny?" I said, "Man, you shouted every bit of that. We could hear it all the way out here."
So,
No.
I grew up in, I guess we call it a very low church.
Yeah.
Fundamental theology or anything.
Right. Yeah.
So I've been trying to wrap my head around just the whole concept. It's very foreign.
Right.
I guess one of the big tensions that I'm feeling is, I was raised on this idea of like there should be no barriers between even forgiveness or whatever.
Right.
You be able to sit down,
Yeah.
pray that prayer or whatever it was, cliche,
Right.
That was that. You were right with God in that moment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even that I think would have kind of its own issues of this limitation to time.
Right.
The whole thing was that it kind of went, it was without time. But anyway,
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of where I'm hearing like reconciliation, confession. It feels so temporary. So like, and it just feels weird to me to go, oh, you have to do this X amount, of frequency.
Yeah.
Does my question make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. And let me kind of pick out the elements and all of that to kind of give you a picture of how it might differ from, let's say, a non-denom tradition or some of the churches that don't have a sacramental practice, which also are are very often echoed to one degree or another in non-denoms. One thing is that the emphasis on sacraments in the Anglican Church is not in the first place about gatekeeping or about it being inaccessible or about it being temporary. It is, in fact, one about regularity. In other words, it's woven through the whole of your life in a predictable fashion, so that it is the spiritual path. I preached a sermon several months ago about this is the way, borrowing on the Mandalorian, and it's really interesting to me that the Mandalorian is such an attractive figure to anybody who's ever watched it. This is really cool. This is the way to live a life. And I had lots of friends I was having conversations at that point with who were talking about, I'd like to be a Mandalorian or, at least a Stoic. And because it offers you a path. Well, the sacraments are the path, and they're meant to be constantly available. Second thing is, which is a little bit different from non-denom, or if you want low church, but a lot of people hear low church and they think that's some kind of derogatory remark of some sort. It just means less in the way of sacraments, less in the way of liturgy. But the second point about it is that, and my daughter and I have had a lot of conversations about this because she and her husband go at least part of the time to a non-denom. I would say the difference is that, and I've got to figure out a way to say this. I don't mean this critically, but in a non-denom tradition, you're welcomed into an experience, and you navigate that spiritual experience basically in some sort of interaction with the music and the preaching. Those are the two things that are there to interact as a way of or as a setting in which you might experience the presence of God. So part of the challenge is that you've got to move into a heart space and a head space where that actually happens. Okay? And I mean, that's a very, it strikes us as very new and very, modern, but in fact, that's very much a kind of part of a pietism of centuries gone by in the United States. It's one sort of thread of spirituality that has even older roots than our own country. The difference is, in a sacramental tradition, what you're doing is you're entering into a worship where the whole thing depends on what God has done. And you're invited to participate in what God has done and is doing. So a confession, absolution, exchanging the peace, the healing of the community, taking the body and blood of Christ, that is all about being welcomed into what God has done for us. And it doesn't mean that you might not interact with it emotionally, or you might not interact with it intellectually, but the basic message of it is that this is not about what you do or about what you achieve in terms of an emotional, spiritual, intellectual space. This is about what God has done and is doing on your behalf. And then the other element of your observation that I guess is worth responding to is that it's never, ever about saying you can't have elements of that experience somewhere else in your day-to-day life. And it is never, ever about putting a priest between you and God. In in any sacramental service done with the proper understanding, the priest is simply a conduit for what God does. And even in our older churches where the altar was against the wall and the priest didn't face the congregation, that was pulled right out of the Old Testament, where the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies with 12 stones, 6 on each shoulder, representing the tribes of Israel. And the high priest doesn't go in as someone who controls access to God, but someone who takes the whole of the nation into the presence of God, because physically not everybody can enter the Holy of Holies at any one time, or can't be in Jerusalem at any one time for a worship in the temple. And the priest is doing that with the people included and welcoming them into that process. So that's kind of the image.
Part of this is a reality, but it's kind of like school lunches are the regular way. It's like that's always going to be there, a consistent way to get nourishment. Doesn't mean there isn't other food. That's what's provided for you, kind of meeting your needs. You're the receiver as opposed to the income of it. Like that. You're not going out to a restaurant to get food. It's there.
Yeah, it works to a certain extent, although I'd hate to think that, school lunches were the model for what ought to happen on your dinner table. At least my school lunches.
So I think, Jonah, on your comment about it being temporary, I think especially in the repeatable sacraments, okay, Holy Eucharist, reconciliation, and Holy Unction. And in the tradition, those are really the only repeatable sacraments, okay? They're pastoral. The reason that they're repeated is because we as from a pastoral standpoint, we need them all the time. So if you go to Eucharist, you need to be fed regularly with the body and blood. It's transformative. It's trying to transform. It's not trying. Its intent is to transform you into Christ, or more Christ-like behavior. Okay, so that's that needs to be repeated because we're not very good at sticking there. Okay, the same with unction. You get sick over and over. You get anointed over and over. You can even do, and I have done, last rites multiple times. Someone who thinks they're dying and they recover, that's wonderful. But the next time they think they're dying and, they're still going to need last rites. With confession, it's the same thing. What you've confessed is gone. It's like God digs a ditch. Hey, you don't get to go back over there.
It's like that utility sign that says "Don't dig here."
Yeah.
Only the sign over confession is "Don't dig here ever again."
So you leave that, okay? But that doesn't mean that everything that you've ever done, or everything that troubles you, or that you do in the future that troubles you, okay, is automatically dealt with. So if it keeps you up at night, okay, or wakes you up at 3:00 in the morning, it's probably time to go to confession. Okay, and dump it. It goes somewhere else, and it's no longer part of your life. Yeah, John.
So part of my experience with my son, that he grew up in the local church, and I grew up in a high church. So growing up Catholic, going to a priest for confession has very.
Yeah.
So in college, when it was proposed that there's a different and also this non-denom, I guess, notion of, boy, it's a cult that says that there's a mediator
Yeah.
Just more of a comment. I think
Yeah.
to me it stems from, well, a number of things. Underlying it, that doesn't matter for a whole different discussion. But at the tangible level, it seems to be, oh, we're interpreting scripture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think the whole idea that that the priesthood and the sacraments are all kind of cultic and they separate you from God. I think that's a package deal with anti-Catholicism that arose in the wake of the Reformation. And of course, the longer that frame of mind lasted, uh, the further and further the church moved from a sacramental understanding of the Christian faith. I mean, Luther was still essentially a Roman Catholic. And I mean, and Luther never intended to start a church, never mind anything that might be called the Protestant Reformation. And he wasn't alone in being critical of some of the excesses either. I mean, there was a whole Catholic Reformation going on that really makes calling the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, is historically misleading. I think, and I get the logic of you don't let anyone get between you and God. But I think that's a misunderstanding of what spiritual authority is all about. And you see it in non-denoms, where actually the people in charge really are intermediaries between you and God, and not real healthy intermediaries between you and God at that. I mean, we've got some friends who live in Dallas, and the number of non-denom pastors who have crashed and burned just in the last couple of years, you can't count. And the question is why? And well, there's no accountability structure for one thing. And I'll grant you our accountability structure doesn't always work, but at least it's there. I mean, our ministry is an extension of the bishop's ministry. And the bishop's ministry is an extension of the bishops that can be traced all the way back to the apostolic age. And by virtue of all of that, we're accountable as well to Christ. Whereas in the case of what's been going on in the non-denom, I mean, yeah, you could confess that to one of your buddies, but non-denom pastors don't do that. Never mind a lot of guys. I mean, I spent a lot of time in guys groups, and I got to tell you, one of the things guys rarely do is confess their sins to one another. They'll do lots of other things, say lots of other things, brag about a lot of other things, but confess their sins to one another, not so much.
So in my experience too, and this is not an indictment. So
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand.
in my experience too, it seems to be solidified like, oh, a couple years later, found out the priest that was almost going to confess to was jailed.
Right. Well, yeah, and I mean, and the scandal among Catholic priests in the last several years is an illustration of how sometimes the accountability structures don't do what they're supposed to do. But that, like so many other things, that's not a failure, I think, in the system, if you will. It's a human failure. I mean, let's face it. There's no calling any of us can have, whether it's as lay people or ordained, as mothers or fathers, as friends, as siblings, that we can't or don't fail in. Natalie and I, when we were doing work with seminarians and with people preparing for the priesthood, when we would do vocational retreats, we would find a time to say, and now if this conversation about being a priest scares you to death, good. Then you're getting close to having a fair appreciation of what it is you're actually signing up for here, because it really should scare you.
For those of you like Jonah or John who have been in this more non-denom world, or even if you've been in a Protestant world for a long time but nobody's talked to you about it, ordination, holy orders is a it's a little bit like baptism. It's a little bit like marriage. Okay, for the priest, it's a commitment. It's a commitment in those senses on the priest's part, but it's a covenant between the person called into ministry and God
and the church.
And that covenant is that that we have been given the responsibility to preach and teach the gospel honestly. We have been given the responsibility to administer the sacraments. And we've been given the responsibility to actually, the technical word is not administer. That's a very Protestant word. It's a word that's going to sound strange. It's to confect them. To make with is where it comes from, the Latin, to make with, so that when we hold up bread and wine and say, this is my body, or this is my blood, it is. That's the covenant, because Christ works through the priest. So that if you make your confession to the priest, okay, it's real scary for 7 and 8 year olds. I wish the Catholics didn't do that, but then again, try and think about a 13 or 14-year-old. It's going to be just as scary, and they're going to have a lot more to confess, right? So it gets to be harder. But it's a matter of Christ, committing yourself to being available to Christ's work through you, and that's a pretty big deal. It's not, ordination is not just a licensing process to get you the right to marry people, for example. It's something else altogether. And it changes you in the same ways that baptism changes you. You are not the same person when you're baptized. You're not the same person that you were when you came into the church that morning. No matter how old you are a different person. You belong to Jesus. Ordination is a different kind of belonging to Jesus. So, the one other thing I would say is that we've, a lot of people go, well, they give you these silly prayers. Like most people who start making confession when they're little don't understand why the priest just gave them an Our Father and 3 Hail Marys. Okay? And they're always waiting. If you had brothers and sisters, they were sitting outside waiting to find out how big a penance you got, because then they knew whether you had done something really bad or not. The whole point of your penance is there is nothing you can do that's commensurate with having separated yourself from God in sin. Nothing. Okay? And God has taken you back. The penance is to remind you that you just had to do this little thing. And God's grace has covered everything else. So it's deliberately not proportionate. Because if it was proportionate, then you'd spend the rest of your life trying to straighten out, which is what Luther was after. You can't spend your whole life trying to make it good. But this is about disproportionality. God's grace covers everything. So do this little thing to remind you how big God's grace is. But somehow that never gets explained to Catholic kids.
Or they don't remember it.
Or they don't remember it. Most probably if you're 7 or 8, you don't remember it. But
we
anyway,
better stop.
Yes, we better stop.
Okay, friends, thanks. I hope
you.
this is helpful. That was a bit of a diversion, a sidetrack, but hopefully a productive sidetrack. Okay.